This episode of the podcast is brought to you by the Spotlight Project. The Spotlight Project is an amazing organization with the mission of raising employment for individuals with intellectual or developmental disabilities. Spotlight creates and sells beautiful jewelry, and each person they employ has an intellectual or developmental disability and a unique story to tell. You can give them a visit at thespotlightprojectco.com. Again, that's thespotlightprojectco.com, and use the coupon code HOPE, HOPE, for 15% off your purchase.
Okay, so I'm Ramesh Nagarajah. I'm from Boston, Massachusetts. I grew up in the city in Roxbury to two parents in a multicultural household. My dad's from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and my mom is from Boston. Actually grew up for many years in the house that we grew up in. And you know, it was cool growing up in that household. I have two siblings, an older brother named Raj. He's 25. He went to Bowdoin College, played football there, and works in tech based out of Boston.
Yep.
My little sister's 20. She goes to Gettysburg College. She's also a political science major, and I think she also does something with religious studies. And you know, we all were in the METCO program growing up, which anyone local to Boston knows is it's a voluntary integration program that started in the late 60s after or during the civil rights movement, and has been running ever since, busing inner city kids, mostly minorities, to suburban schools with the hope of, on one side, improving the diversity in those schools and also giving a better educational opportunity to the city students.
Mm-hmm.
So from there, I started in Weston when I was 3, went through it all the way until I was 18.
Wow.
And went on to the Naval Academy. Always wanted to go there, and I just graduated and am now a Marine Corps officer, headed to grad school at Carnegie Mellon, and I have my degree in political science with honors from the Academy.
That's really exciting. Congratulations. I'm interrupting you.
Very good.
For the Naval Academy, you knew you always wanted to go there. What drew you to it?
I think as a young kid, I never really grew out of the little boys think soldiers are cool thing.
Yeah.
And in 5th grade, my cousin was a Marine.
Okay.
And I remember seeing him in the uniform, and we were always the cousins that people compared. Like they're like, you're like Daniel.
Yeah.
And I was like, I want to be a Marine Corps officer. And, you know, I always knew I wanted to go to school. So, you know, what's the best path to do that is to go to the Naval Academy. So thankfully I got some good advice when I was in around 8th grade and knew to start early on that process and to be prepared. Okay. And all the chips sort of fell into place, and I ended up there.
That's awesome.
Never really went through the searching for what college I want to go to when like junior year hit, but
yeah, a painful time for many. And then what drew you to political science as a major?
So I actually started as an economics major for a semester.
Yeah.
Because the Academy has groups for the majors, group 1, group 2, and group 3, and there's like kind of like a shade thrown on group 3 majors, which is like your humanities.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to be a group 2 major, so I went with what's called quantitative economics. And then, you know, I didn't like it. You know, I was good at it and I was doing well in the course load, but I wasn't excited by just learning really how money works and how it moves around in these systems. And I was already drawn to political science, but didn't go with it, even though, you know, I knew one day I probably wanted to get into politics or maybe go to law school. And like, of the majors at the Academy, that's probably most fitting for either of those tasks.
Okay.
And then eventually I was just like, you know what, like I should be doing something that I really enjoy and in a course load that I'm already spending most of my free time reading things like articles or podcasts like that apply to this sphere, not economics. So I made the switch, and then, you know, I loved it. I did really well in the major, you know, the honor society, and, you know, ultimately wrote a thesis. And
oh, wow.
I enjoyed it a lot because the professors within the department are all really knowledgeable and passionate about what they do, which I think is true within every major, but, you know, our interests overlapped in this area.
Right.
And had a great time with it. Some great people in the major, and some excellent courses that really grew my thinking.
And what was your thesis on?
I did my thesis on the Black church and politics and how size relates to that activity. So I wanted to do something that connected to, the Black community. And I specifically dove into always knowing that the church was a major vehicle for politics in the Black community, especially like looking at the civil rights movement. But a
Yeah.
lot of research nowadays was sort of lacking and, inconclusive about whether that relationship still exists. And I was really curious with how mega churches are that's kind of a pun, but really big thing now and growing. And you have these massive churches where a lot of the members aren't from the community the church exists in.
Okay.
And you don't have this personal relationship with your pastor or the leadership within the church. And
Huh.
I was like, I wonder how things like that have affected whether or not it's still a serious vehicle within the Black community for engaging in politics.
And what did you find?
So it's still much more influential in the Black community than in the general community of churches.
Okay.
And it's also certain things like souls to the polls, which is like one of the more common things people know Black churches for, like certain behaviors, because I looked at a multitude of behaviors. Certain behaviors like that are still extremely popular within the Black church and not always popular across generally churches, and very positively linked with size. And size just kind of allows a church to, I would dive more deeply into this if I could. And, I like to say I didn't do my best work with my thesis because I got a little caught up with everything else in school. But
That's fair.
but like the financial resources and everything and just the ability to reach more people in a mega church or a large church usually rates more positively with them taking on a scope that's bigger than just religion.
Right. And that makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned in your Medium article that religion has been important to you, growing up. You had a strong church community, I believe you said. Was it a large church? Do you feel like that influence was there for you in the political realm, or?
Well, I think I went to a decently sized church, about 300 members maybe.
Okay.
Which in Boston, I guess, is on the larger side, but nothing like when you get to like down south or even where I am now, where they have these churches with 5,000 members, and it's like there's another one across the street.
Wow.
So for me, I would say it was more my church life deeply influenced like my value set, which I think then translates over to the way you see policies and what's important, and charity or looking out for other people. And I think that really influences the view you take on a lot of like welfare politics or things like that, which are like these hot topics, or like abortion, for instance, or LGBTQ, and like how you form those views and how they then develop and grow and change all stems from there. And then my church was a huge part of why I was in METCO, because there were a lot of METCO families in that. And if you know METCO families, like your chances of getting into the METCO program are a lot higher, just like who you connect with.
Right.
And
your network.
That's the reason why there were so many families within the church, this one church of many in Boston, like the ton of METCO students came from. And I think there's like an educational value, or like the specific community I was in at this church. I think there were a lot of families that really valued education higher than what I saw generally across the community, and had kids who I watched grow up and become Division I athletes or Ivy League students or doctors by the time they're like 27. Like I was seeing stuff like that, which I think was rare to see in the community I was in.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then you see that and you want to model yourself after that individual. Yeah. And it's a positive feedback loop.
So I guess I should probably start in why I wrote the article and sort of what the motivation behind all that. So obviously all these discussions were starting in the wake of George Floyd's death. And I think actually before that with Ahmaud Arbery, and just sort of, I think we were all in a very unique place because of the virus and being home, and all just generally being reflective and reading more probably, and being more in tune with what's going on in the world. And I think it was a very unique time where these issues really picked up a lot of steam really quickly. And, I'm a guy who likes to discuss important things with my friends. And like, I'm the guy who's having like a deep conversation with someone in the middle of a party sometimes. Like I'm that guy, and like my friends know that. And for that reason, you know, I had a lot of friends coming to me to talk about these issues, and you know, I wanted to be able to offer some insight, but I like to take the perspective of like, I try to listen early on when these things are happening, and like read and let my thoughts build up, and I'll start a new note on my phone and just like add a thought at a random time, and then I'll sit down, and I've always appreciated writing. I just find it cathartic. And like it really organizes my thoughts succinctly, and like I can speak well, but I think I can write better. So I sat down one night and I just put all the thoughts down on paper within like 4 hours, sent it to my buddy to edit, and then within a few hours I posted this article. And you know, my perspective on it was, I thought there was a piece of the conversation that was missing, which is, you know, obviously there's so much anger rightfully and all these feelings rightfully on display, but I thought there was like a very unique lens that a person who's very close with the white community, but affected personally by these issues and has skin in the game, for them to give a perspective, I think I thought would connect better with a lot of, frankly, in my experience, a lot of good white people who just maybe don't understand where they play a role in this, or how they can be better, or what things they've seen and maybe never recognized. And then on top of that, how much of it was like, have I just been assuming that they know these things, when the truth is I maybe never talked to them about it? Because like, to me, these things are like obvious, but
so obvious,
within your own sphere and bubble and perspective, like you just know what you know and how you were raised, and what you see in life, and which, if we're doubling down on all these conversations, it's like, that's going to be a reflection of a privilege that you don't even realize you have, which is probably the hardest privilege to talk about. So I wrote the piece expecting it to really just reach, you know, my friends and then their circle of friends, with like, you know, the power of a one-click share, you know, and then suddenly within, you know, 2 days, it's like everywhere, and it's like spreading like wildfire, you know. But by the end of like up now, it's like 2.5 million views on Medium, and like they made me a partner, and I've had calls all the time. You know, that first couple weeks, I couldn't even be on my phone. I would have to cut out like 5 to 7 hours a day every 2 days or so to just go through all my messages and respond to various platforms. And I got like this first taste ever of like, wow, this is like what it would feel like to be someone who's like writing influentially or podcasting influentially, like very difficult, but like it was incredible because I was hearing all these stories from so many different people, connecting with METCO graduates from the 90s or 80s, or someone from South Africa wants me to get on a call with their students, because like they're like, it's different, but our similar, like your story tells exactly what it's like for our kids who are in these all white schools in Johannesburg, or, you know, just people from everywhere talking to me all the time. And it's really, you know, humbled me and grown me. And it's been really awesome to watch my perspective grow, because, you know, I titled it Reflections from a Token Black Friend, because like it was really me reflecting and like writing it for myself more than anything, you know, like so I could look back on my experience, see how my perspective has changed and grown. And, you know, I certainly experienced things growing up and through high school, and now I'm getting back to your original question, and things that would go like, I was always a guy who, because I was so immersed in the community, would easily dismiss or shrug off instances that I think for some of my peers in the program were really difficult for them to let go of, and it really hurt them and harmed their experience. And because of that, because I had like a group of loving, very genuine relationships with some white people and their parents especially, like it was easy for me to let things slide or see things for what they are, but not really give them the weight that they were probably due. And like I came to college, and then there was all this work being done by the Globe at the time, actually, on like the racism in Boston. I read all their work and I was like, wow, a lot of this actually makes sense, because like I'm always hanging in these like white parts of Boston, because it was the first time I really realized like, whoa, Boston is like so segregated. Like There's
Yep.
a black neighborhood, there's a black neighborhood, a black neighborhood, and then there's white neighborhoods. And people will be like, you don't have the Boston accent. And then I'm like, well, that's really only in the white part of Boston. Like,
Right.
and like, I realized that, and I realized I would be out in these places like Cisco Brewery in Boston and like be one of 4 black people there. And like, some people would give me weird looks or be surprised if I want to talk to them or like, what's
Yep.
he doing? Or when I'm in like parts of South End and I realize like the deep racial tension history there. And I'm like, well, now it kind of makes sense when I get kind of oddly treated in some like bars or when I'm trying to like get in somewhere. Like, and then when that started to click for me, and then I got to like the systemic levels of like, number one, it's been 40, 50 years while METCO's been around. Why is that still a
Why?
program? Like,
Yep.
like, why would there be a need for this program? And like, why are the schools honestly in the city probably in worse condition than they were then? You
Yep.
know, and then doubling down, like again, I always realized it was rare that my family was by no means like a wealthy family. Like we had to struggle for things and my parents could never buy us all the things we wanted, but like by all means, it was a lot easier for me to fit into Weston and do things with my Weston friends than some of my other friends in the METCO program who like needed to work after school
Yep.
or take care of their siblings or had a
Right.
single parent household. And then I'm realizing like, whoa, like in that Boston Globe piece, it's like around the number, it's like only 4% of the black families in Boston belong to the middle class, which is like a crazy number
That's
if you're calling it the middle
crazy
class.
number.
You know, it should be more like 30 to 40%.
Yeah.
And me realizing that, I was like, well, that explains a lot of the differences in my story and actually helps me understand a lot how I'll meet friends from the South who've been to Boston or like it's a big thing in sports athletes, black athletes talking about how they hate playing, like visiting and playing Boston because they're like, I've never experienced more racist fans in my life.
Right.
And all this stuff was like new for me when I was first getting into school and facing these issues. But then it sort of started to grow and me starting to realize it a lot, especially as I got friends who were from such different parts of the country, whether that was my white friends from the Midwest and the
Yeah.
South, or like specifically my black friends who grew up in the South and in Georgia and in South Carolina and in Alabama, Mississippi. And they're like, dude, like where I'm from, you do not interact with the white people. Like the white people, a lot of them make like you would feel like they hate you. Our communities are like the tension is like obvious and
Yeah.
clear. And like it being really hard for them to come and for the first time in their lives be the only black kid in the classroom or the only black kid in the friend group or on a football team because we played lightweight football,
Hmm.
which unlike maybe any football team in the country is like majority white. Maybe you only get that in like the NESCAC schools.
Oh yeah.
Uh, and like that experience and watching that change and like us come from 2 different perspectives and like come to the sort of this middle ground where like now I recognize some of these issues and see them for what they are. But then my friend on the other side who is so polar opposite from my comfortability with white people,
Yeah.
watch that perspective come closer. Like, well, now I see I can have genuine relationships with these people. And like, there's still going to be a lot of instances of like microaggressions or stuff that's painful. But like, as we build a real relationship, we can actually talk about these issues. And like,
Right.
I
Address them
even
head on.
enlighten some of my friends down south to be like, like they're not all bad, man. Like there's bad ones and like there's people who are raised wrong, but it's more often than not, they're just raised wrong. And like there's
Right.
a place where they can grow. And that was what the transition was like when I was going through high school. Because my perspective, like I've had some other MECO students say like they enjoyed reading my piece, but like I don't agree with it because
Okay.
you had a really positive experience in MECO, but I can name 10 people like me who hated it and who really would look back and wish they didn't have to go through these like painful experiences when they were like 12 years old.
Right.
Yeah. And me starting to understand that more and me also, I come from like a really, it relates to like the type of personality I am and like things I'm choosing to do in my life. Like certain things I see as like, well, you still were given an amazing opportunity. And even if it wasn't always great for you, like you can't deny the fact that it was beneficial to you,
Mm-hmm.
and like where you are in life and what academic opportunities you've had and connections you've been able to build, or just teams that you were able to be on and the funding they were able to have that then made you a better athlete.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's the perspective I tend to take on a lot of things. So
Right.
for that reason, it contributes to why I easily, my nature sometimes is I too easily discount some of the negative experiences,
Right.
because I overwhelmingly focus on the fact that like I was just blessed to have this compared to like my neighbors, or
Right.
like who I played basketball with as a kid or little league with as a kid, knowing that they would have like killed for those opportunities.
Right. Right. And they might see it as, not to speak for them, but like, why can't we all have those opportunities? Like, you
Yeah.
shouldn't have to go through painful experience or be blessed to have it.
Yeah.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
we just should have had the same base
Mm-hmm.
level, and we didn't.
Mm-hmm.
In Boston, I mean, so you were used to being the only Black person with a ton of white people, and then your friends in the South were not, because their schools were, they went to all Black schools, and this. But I feel like segregation is still just so prominent in both places. It just plays out really differently.
Really differently.
And what do what do you and your friends have to say about that? What did you learn about talking to your friends from Alabama, and what did they learn from you? I guess.
Well, I think it's like when you boil it down to the soup and nuts, like it's the same thing.
Right.
It's
Except,
just
yeah,
one community has had a narrative that allows them to give a facade that's not there,
yeah,
and the other one has a narrative where like, well, you're from the South, which you admittedly like Civil War and like how that then perpetuates, and like Jim Crow, the focus is always in the South,
yeah.
and like the narrative is way different and more obvious, and because of that, like racism is permitted to be more obvious
Hmm.
by people who like celebrate it, like
Hmm.
people more comfortable with it, number one. And then on the flip side, like the experiences were so much more painful and open for the people who were, you know, disenfranchised, that the feelings uh of like bitterness and fear and sadness are way more on display as well. So like that passes itself down in how you raise your kids and the attitudes that they have.
Right.
So like we don't talk about that, like in the North, go way back, like there was still slavery in the North, and like
Oh yeah.
Emancipation Proclamation only actually freed the slaves in the South, not in
Right.
the North. Like, or like Jim Crow was a huge thing up here, or like I'm in Annapolis, and like which is in like a really funky place because it's like it was the South, but it was the North, and like
Right.
they stayed. But like Annapolis was one of the biggest slave ports. I think it was the biggest slave ports on the East Coast.
Wow.
Like things but we don't talk about that
We don't
here.
talk
Like
about it.
how downtown Annapolis, where I just was, is so pretty and awesome and beautiful and boating, but like 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it was predominantly Black, and then it was like heavily gentrified,
Huh.
and now you only see the Black people in another part of Annapolis,
Right.
like,
And we don't talk
and
about
like things like that we don't talk about, like
it. Yep.
in Boston, how like racism was a huge thing. And when integration happened, it's easy to think of like the Little Rock Nine or
Hmm.
Ruby Bridges and all that occurring in the South. But like my mom rode on buses where they were throwing rocks at the, like parents were throwing rocks at the buses. And like that's one generation removed, you know?
Right. That's not that long
But we
ago.
don't talk about that.
No,
And it's
no.
all just very covert in Boston because we're a liberal hub. Like we're liberal on everything, and we talk about issues, but like that doesn't mean that we always have addressed them, you know?
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, I've lived in Boston for 2 years now, and that just like it, it's it's so pervasive, and like it just isn't talked about at all. I mean, and I will never experience that feeling, but it is just so crazy when you walk into a bar and I look around and everyone looks exactly like me except for 5 people.
And
That's
like
like,
I think Boston, if anything, speaks perfectly to sort of like the new age racism that people like is the hot topic now,
yep.
where like you honestly do not see a lot in my perspective, comparably, like if you're weighing both, like the systemic racism that's obviously on display is everywhere if your eyes are open to it.
Yes.
Like it's everywhere. Like I'm from Dudley Square, which is now Nubian Square. Like they renamed it for that like to recognize that it was like a historically black area.
Mm-hmm.
But like watching the gentrification occur there has been crazy. Like I remember like when I was like a freshman in high school, if you saw a white person like walking down the street, it was the weirdest thing ever. And now half my neighbors are white, which is like fine with me. Like
Okay.
I have nothing against those people. Like a lot of them are students or like young professionals, and a lot of them are nice neighbors. But like it speaks exactly to like there are people who I knew owned businesses in that area for like 50 years through their family, and like they're closed now and they're something else. They're like a checks cashing or something.
Right.
Things like that, and recognizing that like this in Boston, it's not growing together.
No.
Like,
It's pushing people further to the
really
edges.
growing in a great way, but like good luck finding any black people in the new improved Seaport or in what's happening in Southie right now, where it's becoming amazing. Like, you know, it's sad, especially for a guy like me whose perspective, like I said, is so much different because it's so rare that I'm from the middle class,
Mm-hmm.
and my family won't ever have to worry about losing our house there. Like,
Right.
knock on wood, like it would take something very drastic for even things to go like crazy for us to lose our place there. Like,
Right.
but you know, I see the community change. Like for specifically where I live, it's like so many Somali families who like were originally refugees, and like
Mm-hmm.
watching them sort of be pushed closer and closer away in their radius from like there's a mosque there, so that's why a lot of them chose to live there.
Okay.
And like just watching something like that occur, where like they're not even what I would consider like what you typically think of in terms of how race plays itself out. Like you tend to like think of people from Africa as separate, but like it's the same thing occurring of like
Yep.
just minority areas of Boston.
Right. And where, I mean, for like the community members whose businesses have been closed, where are they going? Just further away from the city, or?
I mean, I think a lot of them are, you know, either, you know, selling whatever property they had.
Yeah.
And then maybe they're in a place where, you know, I hope it ended up all right.
Yeah.
But like the most notable one that if you asked anyone who grew up around Dudley is Nubian Notion.
Yeah.
Like it was just a corner store. It's like really all it was. And they sold like some clothes in the back and different things like that. But like it's really just a corner store. But like everyone knows Nubian Notion if you're from that area. And it's gone, you know, like the building was redone, and the building is beautiful now, and that part is really awesome. They're redoing the library. The police station's beautiful. Like the building that behind it is the Teachers Union of Boston. It's really pretty. But that store's gone, and then there's stores in the bottom of where they redid the Teachers Union, like that were there for a long time, that are gone. You know, it's disheartening.
It is disheartening. It's very disheartening. I was listening to a conversation with Ibram X. Kendi, and someone asked, you know, what do you think we should do about gentrification and like, but also wanting to, you know, white people wanting to live in areas to, you know, make the school system better, to have your taxes contribute to the school system, but not be forcing Black people or, you know, BIPOC people out of those communities. Like, what is the solution to this? Mm-hmm. And I don't think we have an answer yet, but I don't know, as a political science major, it's all policy. So
also such a complicated conversation because, you know, I've had that gentrification conversation with a good amount of people, including like, for instance, my buddy who's a state representative in Massachusetts, or one of my neighbors who's like very deeply involved with community work and politics. And like, he was like, hey man, like Boston has tried, and they can do better, obviously, but like in certain aspects of gentrification has tried to do better. Like they give preferential leases or preferential auctions for people who have lived in the community before. Or if you're a Black family, they do programs with lotteries and stuff like that where you can get into these communities and be there, and it would hopefully match whatever means you have. And he's like, a lot of Black people just don't take advantage of them, you know? And then that gets to a really complicated aspect, because it's like part of that is built on itself. Like, if Black people are already unaware of these opportunities and there's already a prevailing narrative of what's happening and you don't think there's any way you can fight it, you might not know to be looking for these opportunities to fight it, or know that you can do these programs or you can do this. And like, then it's kind of on the city to publicize it better and make sure that people are getting into these communities, and like initiate programs that like look at someone who lives there and fits the profile and like directly tells them like, hey, you can do this.
Right.
Like, but then on the other side, like, you do have to have some sort of, you know, like, it's on us. We need to start being better about holding on tightly to our communities and supporting our businesses. Because, you know, if, for instance, and I can't say specifically what happened with UB Notion, but what if everyone in the community around was just like, on April 14th, we're all buying something from there.
Right.
Which could result in a crazy amount of money that could last a long time for them. Or like, just something like that. Like every Monday, which is always like a thing people try to start, like Black Owned Friday or something like that, like doing something like that, or my own Minority Owned Monday. But like, if we would actually put our money where our mouth is,
right,
a lot of things we could fight on our own. And like, that's where you get to the really complicated debates of like, there's a part of it that's on us as a community, and then there's a part of it that's just on the system.
Yeah.
And but like, there is a power disparity there in terms of how much more easily the system can affect immediate change versus the community itself.
Right. And also, I guess there's a piece of the system. You need to believe that your voice matters and that you have purchasing power. And when a system tells you that you don't, it's really hard to feel like, no, actually I do, and we can do this. It's just, again, like a vicious cycle.
The loop that plays on itself.
Yeah. So then, if you don't mind talking a bit more about Indianapolis and the Naval Academy, and I mean, you're all in this system together, which seems incredibly demanding and intense, but everyone comes from a different background, as you've been saying, and sort of navigating that and facing racism there. And
it's really unique because, you know, it's a federally funded school completely. So everyone, you get someone from every single part of the country, like every congressional district, and you get people from all over the world, and like, who are our allies in there. So it's like, the community is so cool, because I'm so thankful that I didn't just go to, you know, like play D3 football at an SCAC school and like mostly only see Northeasterners, you know, or go down to like, even if you went to like a UVA or something, like majority of the kids are just from Virginia and then from like Jersey. Like, that's really where a lot of them come from, and their families worked in, it's like Jersey and West, you know, or like if you go a little deeper, it's like everybody's from Westchester and Darien, Connecticut, you know? So I'm really thankful that I got the experience of meeting, like having a best friend from suburbs of Chicago, then a best friend from Georgia, then a roommate from Albany, Georgia, and then another roommate from San Diego, and another roommate from Colorado Springs, like really cool, or a best friend from Tennessee, like really unique attitudes. And like, I'm coming from hyper liberal Boston, and like, I'm hearing friends say things that I haven't heard said in years, because we just don't say those things in Boston. Like, you would be destroyed by someone if they heard you say like this joke or something. And like, me coming from this perspective was like, okay, now I have to like gear myself to like help friends along in this area. But there's also like, I also learned another perspective of like, I now understand when I hear the narrative of like, it's not that serious, man. Like, I get where it comes from now, because like, I've met very, very good people who at the same time may perpetrate some of these things that like I've been raised to think of as like you just don't do ever.
Right.
You know, I could take this really like assaulting view on it and like, well, these people shouldn't be my friends then. But like I don't think that's productive at all. And I think it doesn't recognize that like we're just from two different communities, you know, and
Right.
the same way if I met someone from like an Islamic nation in the Middle East, they're probably going to have some things they say about women that I just vehemently disagree with, but like doesn't mean we can't grow together to like change those attitudes. And like I'll probably learn something too about why his culture functions that way.
Right.
You know?
Instead of shutting down that conversation before
I
you
think
can have it.
with a lot of I think the narrative that prevails in Boston and just sort of liberal politics in general, I think can get to that point because a lot of these issues are so emotionally based and like they provoke a lot of anger and frustration and they've been around for so long that it's like we're just like people need to figure this out. Like why is the women's movement 60 years long, you know? Like why is the civil rights movement, if you really want to like be honest, why is it 300 years long, you know? So like I get those feelings, but at the same time, like I grew a lot by just learning how to be a more accepting person and recognizing of like see people for their values and not always like the reflection of the way they've been raised. Or like, can I really, going into race, like it does no good for me to refuse to be friends with this white friend who says out of pocket things, but other than that has always been loving to me, but grew up in a town where I was the first Black person he ever met now. Like it does no good to him or to a cause I believe in to not have like the resilience in my perspective, determination to like want to grow that relationship. Because like for me, the most difficult person to work with and to talk about these issues with is a common person who I'm around because of the sphere I'm in, which is like this very strong-willed, excellent value set, hardworking person who sees people he judges them alone on their value set and how they treat people and how hard of a worker they are and sees nothing else. And like the class is like, I don't care if you're black, brown, blue, yellow, or red, like as long as you're a good person, which like is a great perspective and starting point, but like it needs to go a step further to recognize like there's going to be differences in everyone's story. And like in the same way I should judge a coworker for, if it's a female, like for how hard she works and her value set and how she treats people and how she engages with the company, I should also be recognizing and considerate of the fact that like maybe there's things that she'll do that are just a reflection because it's uncomfortable to be a woman in a male dominated organization, or like there's things that men project onto her that I'm only projecting because like I'm socialized that way, and that's not actually what's happening. Like she might be doing the exact same thing I would do, but I'm pre-biased to feel a different way. And I think taking that step along in anything, whether it's race or gender or dealing with people from the LGBT community, like taking that step extra is like very difficult to communicate to people who feel like and actively exhibit that they only judge people off their value set and the type of person they are, but aren't realizing that like there's a lot of subconscious and implicit things going on that they might not be aware of. Which is why like one of the hardest things to talk about implicit bias with people is like people don't understand the word implicit. It's like that means you don't know it's happening. Like like
you have no idea that it's just
like
right
you're
there.
trying to describe it to someone, or it's trying to be described to me on something I do, and my reaction is to say like, well, I was thinking this or I was doing this. Like, yeah, that's the exact point. Like you don't realize that it's happening, you know, and you don't know that there's something informing what you're saying that you haven't considered, which is why it's implicit, you know. Like explicit bias is really easy to discuss because it's like you can call it out for what it is and like
have a conversation.
And I think that's an area where people have, frankly, in our time, been trying to grow so much, and it's where that attitude comes from. And I think for people, for instance, like I think LGBTQ issues are really easy to see this one in, because like a lot of people still have a lot of reservations with those issues.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what's becoming a more dominating view, especially within conservative groups, is like you just do you, and if it doesn't affect me and you're not hurting anyone, like more power to you, you know?
Right.
Which is kind of just a reflection of like, I'm not going to explicitly ever be biased towards these people, because I realized that was the view for a while, and I see how that was wrong. And like people who 20 years ago or even 10 years ago would have one view on like when they see the Supreme Court make a certain decision in favor of gay rights,
Mm-hmm.
has a different one now, because they're like, well, yeah, you know, a business shouldn't be able to turn you away just because you're gay.
Right.
Like now they're like, well, explicit bias is obviously wrong, you know, like, and now there's this view of like, well, let's just each do our thing and operate independently. And like, and I think that's a reflection of like the type of growth we've made in explicit bias, where I think we have done really well of making people feel uncomfortable with that. And obviously there's so many levers that say the opposite of like certain things with our administration and things that are out there that have made some people more outright and outspoken about things like that. But I think overall the narrative with explicit bias has been like, it will be positive. And I think the history trend line will show positive growth in that area. But implicit bias becomes really hard to talk about, because it's like a man in the mirror type of thing.
Yeah.
And it's also like we're all guilty of it.
Right.
In something. And you get into like the hypocrites debate, where like you can either take this as like, hey man, this is something I struggle with too, so this is why I want to help you with it and you can help me with it. Or you can take it as like, why are you talking to me, man? You do that too.
Yeah.
And it's like two paths.
Yeah. And
Conversation
I feel like
productive or not.
right. And it seems like right now what we're trying to work through, or like a lot of novels that are being encouraged, are to get through that, hey, don't call me out because you do it too, and more of like, okay, yeah, like we're working on this together. Like I need to check why I reacted that way or felt that way, but it's way harder to like point your finger at you than it is to like, oh, that person said that and that was wrong, versus like, oh, I thought that way, why? Like, what's up with that?
Yeah. And it's all so personal, which makes it even harder.
Yeah.
You know, because like for instance, I think so many of these solutions people agree with when it's on the grand scale and when it's theoretical or not impacting you. But it's when it enters like the sphere of your life and you feel like you've been a good person.
Yeah.
That you're like, now this is really hard.
Yeah.
Like for instance, like something that's always been a hot topic, affirmative action. In theory, majority of people would probably agree that like to right the wrongs of the past, you probably need to do some things to equal the playing field before you can transition to just equal policies where like weighing objectively.
Right.
But then as soon as it's your daughter or your son that's not getting into school, like you really latch onto that argument of like, well, she only got in because she's black.
Yes.
My daughter,
blame someone else.
like, especially if you have a son who's cisgender and it's straight, like it fits the mold of the demon. Like you're like, well, how is he supposed to get into Harvard? He's freaking white male straight athlete. Like,
yeah.
and like I sympathize with that argument. It's just like we need people to step a little deeper than that and understand like to treat it instead as like it's your honor. You should think of it as like, wow, it's my honor that I can like positively impact this issue through a decision I make in my personal life. Like a lot of times it's just on the system and what policies are out there which guide like interest rates or things like that. Like, but here's one where like, because I know this is important and because I know these issues still affect people, my son's going to be all right either way. Yeah. And maybe he did. Maybe he was that one or two people that were on the crux with another person and the difference was the gender or the race.
Yeah.
But like, can you take a step back and look at how you just made a positive change that's going to help everyone eventually? because maybe he ends up having a daughter or marrying someone who's Black and having a kid who has to face these issues, or he has a best friend who's positively impacted him and is of a different race. And like,
Mm-hmm.
you're helping that community, which in turn is helping you.
Right.
And I think you could step back and see that that's when something where we can get past a lot of what I would call is in the weeds in terms of keeping us from getting any further.
Right. Instead of reacting with like, that anger of this is so
Woe is me.
unfair,
Woe
more
is
of
me.
like, yeah, the woe is me, I'm the victim, that moving on and just, knowing that, especially for if you have a white child, like it might not be Harvard, but they'll get into another school and they really just, they will be okay. And hopefully by allowing someone else to be more okay than they maybe would have been because they don't have the same opportunities granted, like we're all moving up together.
Yeah. And like, I thought this was an original thought when I shared it, but I think it actually comes from Ibram X. Kendi because someone was reading his book and mentioned it to me, which is like his response to the colorblind society view, which like, and I thought of this, through my conversations with the people, and I see now how it's like, he's a brilliant mind. So I'm like, it's a substantive thing, which is you can't go from a color focused society and then just snap and make it a colorblind society without spending some sort of period in between to correct for the issues of color focused society. Because if you go snap into the other one, then those inequalities just continue to perpetuate themselves.